More and more graphic designers are trying to break into UX design. But it's not that easy, and that's because most people don't know what the difference is between a piece of physical media and designing for a digital experience. From my time teaching bootcamps and masterclasses, as well as working as a product designer for the last 5 or 6 years, I've learned what that fundamental difference is. But more than that, I've also identified 6 other key things which are so important to understand if you want to make the move. So come with me as we talk through them. I'm Parvin, that was the intro, and these are 7 things that any graphic designer should know about UX design. So all design is about solving a problem. This is what differentiates art from design. Art is something which exists in and of itself, whereas design has to be solving some sort of problem. The problem that graphic design or package design is usually trying to solve is one of information. How can we get this information across in the most efficient way which conveys other aspects of the brand or what this is for, all in order to make them feel a very specific kind of way when they're absorbing that information. UX design, I would argue, solves far more general problems. Apps and websites aren't always about getting information across. You could be on a website trying to book a blood test or fill out your tax return or mastering electronic music or modeling an energy grid. And so you might think it's hard to come up with a rule or some guidance that covers all of these situations. But there is actually one thing to keep in mind. And this comes from Steve Krug, and it's his mantra, "Don't make me think." Basically, how can you get a user to the end goal of what they're trying to do with as little cognitive load as possible? One thing to think about when trying to get a user to that goal is Jacob's law, which states that most users spend most of their time on other people's apps than your app. So you don't want to try and reinvent the wheel or change what is the standard way of doing things. You just want to use patterns that they're familiar with. So once you understand Don't Make Me Think and Jacob's law, the way to put this into action is with the EAS framework. Eliminate anything that's not needed, automate what you can, and simplify what's left. And this is what all of UX design is trying to do. It's trying to get users to their goals in the most efficient way possible. That's what artifacts like journey maps and personas and all of those like UX things help us to try and do. Obviously, this could be a whole video or even a whole degree course in itself, but that's kind of the basic idea. Now that you've understood that fundamental difference between graphic design and print design and UX and UI design, firstly, you should hit like if you're enjoying this, but secondly, there's 6 more very specific tactical things that I think it's worthwhile trying to understand. The first is how layout paradigms work. Now, layout paradigms is a fancy way of saying flexbox or grid or HStack or VStack on iOS. These are basically different ways that elements are built up on a page. Unlike in Photoshop or Illustrator where you've got a canvas and you can move things around wherever, in Figma or in code, layers should kind of follow a certain order. And Figma's auto layout, if you've heard of that, is very, very similar to Flexbox, which is what is used in HTML and CSS when building applications for the web. So it's worth spending a bit of time trying to understand the box model, what the difference between margin and padding is, and just a very basic understanding of flex direction or horizontally or vertically stacking items. Once you get your head around that, it will make more sense how people design interfaces for digital experiences rather than for print. The second thing is understanding how color works. Now, color on screens and for digital interfaces is a huge, huge topic. If you're interested in it, I really recommend checking out Dan Hollick's talk from Config this year. It taught me so much about the intricacies of things like color spaces and color models and perceptual variation. The thing that I want to mention here, though, is this idea of color contrast and accessibility. When you print stuff, it's often easier to read things because the way stuff looks on screen doesn't match how it looks in print, and you'll always go and check things with proofs. The equivalent to doing that in a digital world is by checking color contrast ratios. This is basically a set of 2 numbers which say the ratio between different colors, and there's basically a minimum contrast ratio that you need to hit for your text to be legible and accessible to all users. And there are guidelines of this which are slowly changing and being updated, so there's loads more you can read about this if you're interested. Next is the idea of components. So you might have seen this in Illustrator with symbols, but components are such a big part of designing for user interfaces in Figma, but also are such a big part of how things are made in code. Basically, a big principle in computer programming is DRY, do not repeat yourself. And one way to do that is to chunk out little blocks of code which have different bits of functionality, make them into a component, and then you can reuse it in lots and lots of places. The other thing to know is that components can have properties. So to make sure that your component isn't the same every single time you use it, you can use a property to change what is happening. So in React, those are called component props. In Figma, you might have seen variants or component properties and text properties. Just understanding that kind of basic model of don't repeat yourself, use components, try and make things as consistent as possible is really important, and is something which I think print and graphic design don't put as much emphasis on. Next up is how people read on the web. This might sound kind of obvious, but the way we read prose or printed material is so different. Usually when we read prose, we're able to sit down and read through paragraphs at a time and concentrate. But there's something about the blue light of screens and our experience of using a web browser that just means that we read in a very different way. And studies of this, where they glue a camera to someone's face, have shown that we read in what's called an F-shaped pattern, which means that you skim more and more. So the way to think about text on the web is that you should always be emphasizing for people who are skimming. They're always looking at the top left of new paragraphs. That's why LinkedIn influencers like to write those really stupid posts where every new sentence is on a new line. It just really grabs your attention in a way that a block of text can't. The shortcut to remember all this stuff is basically that people don't really read on the web, so you need to design things in a very different way. And that's what content design is. It's about deciding what is the best type of content to get your users to that end goal, because it's probably not just a big block of text. The next piece of guiding advice is something called the law of locality. I've also heard of this as the P in CRAP, which is an acronym for reflecting on and critiquing your own design work. But basically, the law of locality states that things which are related should be placed close together. So here's an example of that in practice. You can see the place where it makes most sense to put the Create Playlist button is next to where other playlists are. That's where a user would expect to find it. And so by placing it there, it helps a user solve their problems in the quickest way possible. Once that clicked for me, it made all my interface design much better. The last quick tip is so super specific: never use a dropdown. There's almost always a better way to get information from a user than using a standard dropdown, whether that's radio buttons or combo boxes or something else. Just try not to use a dropdown as much as possible. Great, thank you so much for watching. Those were 7 quick things print designers should know about UX and UI design. If you're just starting your journey in UX design and want to learn about some of these things, I've got a video about setting up components in Figma, which talks you through auto layout, the best way of using component properties, and will just really help you understand what the best structure for your file is. So you can find that video over here, and I'll see you over there.